again, there are positives about this working at home, and there are also, I think, some very great alarm bells about it. But what seems to be certain is that we are doing what we can without really looking at the psychological impact of what we should in terms of people working at home and not coming into the office. I think there are advantages both ways, but there's a lot of really negative research about people being isolated at home and feeling not quite so much at the tribe. Now, at the moment, leaders are working really, really hard and getting a bit burnt out themselves, some of them, in order to overcome that. And I'm very moved by what leaders are doing, the ones that I'm speaking to, that are doing to try to do that. I'm not sure that going forward that will be sustained. And there will be the assumption, we all know about assumptions, that people will get on with it at home. But what will be, we need a sense of purpose, but we also so much need that sense of connection and that sense of belonging. And how do we keep up a belonging, or can we keep up a belonging if we're not physically, not having all the elements of a relationship like touch, or even pheromones, which tell us how much the person trusts us or not, or the ability just to really kick back and not feel that we have to make the most of this time because it's a Zoom meeting or whatever. And those are my great concerns in terms of the viability of organizations going forward if people don't feel that that's their home. And then also the mental health implications.
Yeah, and I can see there's organisations who are thinking differently about working from home. And I think, in fact, Facebook came out just recently saying, they were looking at a model that didn't really have offices to speak of, or certainly that was a very, very minimalist part of their operating structure. I do think, though, for the industry that I work in, that we will start to come back into the office. It might be a different, and that's already started happening. And in fact, because banking is an essential service, there's some people who have continued to work through in offices. But I am seeing already that there is a sort of beginning of coming back into work, but there will be greater amounts of hours being worked from home. Now, I actually think there's this tipping point with working from home, and I do think that tipping point is very individual, that there is sort of relief and comfort you can get from not doing the daily grind of public transport, and just feeling that you're in this little cocoon and you're able to get on with stuff, even if you do, and you're connecting still via VC or just working through things, but that it's important to have that time in the office where you're connecting as well. And for me, that is probably, I'm very happy working one day from home. I'm not as happy working 2 days from home, but that's perfectly fine. And I probably wouldn't like to work 3 days from home.
Kylie, I think you're so right. In all my clients, I see such different reactions to working at home. Most of them like a lot about it. Some of the single people are really hurting. Marriages are breaking up. I've got a number of clients whose marriages just haven't been able to withstand this strain. And the level of child abuse, for example, in the US has risen 100% in some areas. It's just terrifying. Perhaps, but some people are loving the fact they can get outdoors, they can be in nature, they can take these walks, they take these walks with their partners or their kids, and they're just loving it. So perhaps the question isn't as binary as you and I are looking at it at the moment of work at home, not, or how do you even massage the hours? But maybe the question is, how do we work going forward? And how do we live going forward in ways that are really attached to our neurogenetics, the human system? I'm finding that one of the good things about working from home is that the neighborhoods are getting tighter. Neighbors are speaking to each other much, much more. And that's new in my experience, that more and more the primary relationships during this time have come into the neighborhood a bit. And human beings are basically meant to live and have relationships in smaller groupings. So how do we make it that our work and our home life both would return to something more conducive to being truly human and therefore to our health? How do we put relationship safety first? How do we put time and nature and our relationship to nature really forefront and live in and work and make decisions, making that a priority? Perhaps those are the questions. Not that we can answer them all right now, but I think that's what's coming to me from our conversation so far, that we have to kind of rethink all areas of our lives which have begin to come together in ways they never have before in recent times. And how do we actually put a new lens and challenge the assumptions that we have about the ways that we've been working?
Yes, I think what's really ironic about the lockdown we've all experienced is that in some ways, many people have felt that connectedness has increased in their lives rather than decreased, and that many relationships, both work and family, have deepened.
Yes.
I've had executives from other organisations tell me that when I've asked them about what's it like, people who've even recently joined organisations, when all of their meetings and interactions with people are over video conferencing, and one of the things they've said to me is, you know what, I think I've gotten to know people better than what I would have in the office environment, because I can see where they live and they may be more open about talking about their children who are fighting in the background instead of doing schoolwork, or their dog who's barking. And that's deepened a relationship more quickly than it might otherwise. And, you know, people are connecting more with their distant family, I think, as well, and appreciating the wisdom of the elderly. In fact, I was listening to a podcast by Louis Theroux, who was interviewing Helen Bonham Carter, the famous English actress, and she was talking about how her mum, who's also a famous actress, is happier than she's ever been in years because she doesn't have FOMO because she's normally housebound fairly much. She has this enormous fear of missing out, and she has felt she's not been missing out during the pandemic because everyone's doing what she's doing.
Yes, and yet, of course, this pandemic has hit the elderly in so many ways, you know, so it's again this pro and con, isn't it? One of the things I love when you and I were chatting a few days ago, you were talking about one of the benefits was that you actually weren't in everybody's face so much. And I found that really interesting, this idea that you had more personal space. As I recall, that people weren't coming up to hug you, who maybe you hadn't given permission to hug you, and you felt you actually liked some of the boundary in the space.
Yeah, and I have reflected on that, and interestingly, that's changing, even though the rules aren't changing. But the more I go out now, the more I'm finding that people aren't respecting the 1.5 metre rule. But also
that they are or aren't, sorry.
They are not respecting the 1.5 metre rule. And I think, you know, I fear that we will sort of go back to this sort of craziness that we had before, this very, very busy, you know, people being very close craziness. What I do hope is that, you know, this sense of distance you get is more akin to being in the country, where city people talk about the slowness of the country and why they feel relaxed. So one of the reasons why they feel relaxed is because it's not much slowness, it's that there's more space for everyone. You're not sitting on public transport with someone, or standing on public transport with someone here. You aren't walking down the street with, you know, weaving your way in and out of people getting annoyed because someone's walking slow in front of you. And I just think that having grown up in the country, it took me back to, well, I wonder how much stress is actually created in our lives from this constant feeling of just not having enough space.
I think that's so perceptive. And you know, a long time ago, one of the first things you learn in school as a psychologist is the rat experiment, where you put a number of rats in a box and they get along well because they're very, very social creatures. And then as you add more rats into the box, there's more and more conflict until literally the rats are attacking each other. And I think that we've created a society where there's too many of us in the box. And we live in boxes, we live in, we're warehoused in apartment buildings, the streets are crawling with us. And then you have the workspace where, some of these open plans aren't that open. I walked through some of those offices and people are really, really close together and all their stuff around them, and there's no defensible space. And I wonder if that's played a role in lowering both our physical and emotional immune system. So I think it's a really interesting idea. I totally think you're onto something. And one of the things that we ought to be looking at is how we create space with each other and boundaries. Also boundaries and rules. Hunter-gatherers had very clear rules about who and how you touched. And we don't have those rules, and that's leading into all sorts of problems and all sorts of conflict, I think. So how do we actually create that space within our architecture, in our workplaces, and in our home, and in our boundary setting? I think that's brilliant.
So Alicia, we've talked about some of the changes that we've seen that the pandemic has driven. We've talked about the basic needs of humans around nature and connection, but also space. We've talked about the different experiences people have through this very strange time. What do you think organisations should be thinking about to capture the experience from this moment and turn it into something positive for the culture of their organisation and the way they work?
From my perspective, looking at the future, I think what's really important is that we understand that we haven't been living in accordance with what makes us human. We've made our decisions. We've built up many of our aspects of our society on assumptions that were really wrong, that didn't take account what it is about us that makes us human and what we most need and what we most fear. If we started making decisions based on what the science tells us about human beings, how our brain, how our genetics operate, I think we would come to very different decisions. We were talking about most of our assumptions being wrong. And I think that what people don't understand is that we are living and designing our workplaces and our neighborhoods on very, very faulty assumptions that we're not looking at. So I would like us to sit back, say, okay, we now know what human beings most want and need. It's relationship, nature, relationship safety above all. How do we design? How do we make our organizations, and with every decision, take that into account in our organizations and in our social planning? You've been listening to Dr. Alicia Fortinberry and Kylie Rixon. Thank you.